The prism sits on museum-grade foam in a storage drawer at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Four-sided. Clay, roughly 8 inches tall. Its surface is covered with hundreds of wedge-shaped impressions, cuneiform script pressed into wet clay nearly 4,000 years ago. The catalogue number reads WB444. Scholars call it the Weld-Blundell prism. What it contains is more unsettling than its ancient origins might suggest. This isn't mythology transcribed. It isn't poetry. It's a list. A bureaucratic record. The kind of document administrators create when tracking succession, legitimacy, lineage. The Sumerian king list chronicles every ruler who held power in ancient Mesopotamia, reaching back to a time the text itself calls when kingship was lowered from heaven. That phrase appears in the opening line, matter of fact, as if describing a routine administrative transfer. But then the numbers begin. The first king listed, Alulim of Eridu, ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alangar, reigned for 36,000 years, 8 kings total before the flood. Their combined rule, 241,200 years. Then the text states simply, the flood swept over. After that, kingship was lowered from heaven again, and the reigns become shorter, still impossibly long by our standards, but decreasing with each generation. Modern scholars categorize this as myth, political propaganda, theological legitimization. But the Sumerians, who copied and recopied this text for over 1,000 years, treated it differently. They didn't file it with their religious epics. They kept it with administrative records, royal archives, genealogical documents. They updated it as new kings took power, maintaining an unbroken chain from the antediluvian dynasties through the historical rulers, whose reigns we can verify through archaeology. The prism's clay is cool to the touch, even through archive gloves. The cuneiform impressions create tiny shadows in the controlled lighting. Each wedge was deliberate, each name recorded with the same bureaucratic precision used for tracking grain shipments and labour assignments. The Sumerians didn't distinguish between their mythological and historical kings in this document. They presented them as a continuous lineage. What makes this artefact deeply strange isn't that it claims kings lived for thousands of years. Ancient cultures frequently exaggerated. What's strange is the specificity, not round numbers, not many years or a long time. Exactly 28,800 years, exactly 36,000 years, and stranger still, every surviving copy of the Sumerian king list, found at different sites across Mesopotamia, written centuries apart, preserves these same impossible numbers with remarkable consistency. The Weld-Blundell prism and its companion texts preserve something the Sumerians believed was vitally important, the documentation of divine ancestry, not divine favour, not metaphorical descent from gods, actual genealogical lineage, bloodlines. The texts state explicitly that the first kings were placed in power by the gods, that some kings were semi-divine, that one king, Gilgamesh, was precisely 2/3 god and 1/3 human. They calculated it like a fraction. They tracked it like heredity. Before we dismiss this as primitive mythology, we should acknowledge something uncomfortable. The Sumerians were not primitive. They invented writing specifically to keep accurate records. They developed sophisticated mathematics, including base 60 counting, that we still use for time and angles. They created the first systematic law codes, architectural standards, astronomical observations, medical texts. Their bureaucracy was meticulous. They counted everything, tracked everything, recorded everything. And what they recorded consistently across hundreds of tablets, thousands of lines of cuneiform, multiple cities and dynasties, was this: kingship began with the gods. Certain bloodlines carried divine heritage. That heritage could be measured, tracked, preserved, and, most significantly, diluted over time. Wherever you're listening to this, whether it's morning light through your window or deep night with headphones on, take a moment to comment where you are and what time it is. This investigation works better as a conversation, because what we're about to examine isn't a simple story with a clear answer. It's a mystery preserved in clay, and mysteries require multiple perspectives. The question isn't whether we believe ancient kings descended from gods. The question is, what exactly were the Sumerians documenting? Why did they maintain these genealogical records with such precision? What did they think they were preserving? The well-Blundell prism sits silent in its drawer. The clay remembers every impression. The text remains unchanged. And somewhere in those cuneiform lines is a claim that dozens of generations of Sumerian scribes, scholars and kings treated as historical fact, that the first rulers of human civilization carried divine blood, and that this ancestry, however impossible it sounds, was the foundation of legitimate kingship. This wasn't a belief they adopted casually. It was a system, an infrastructure. They built rituals around it, legal frameworks, succession protocols, temple ceremonies designed specifically to maintain or restore divine lineage. They didn't just claim divine ancestry, they documented the mechanisms by which it was transferred, preserved, and authenticated. The clay is cool and silent. The cuneiform casts its tiny shadows. And the question hangs in the climate-controlled air: were they recording mythology or preserving something they genuinely believed to be genealogical truth? The Archive of Kings. The Sumerian king list exists in more than 18 surviving versions, fragments and complete copies, found at Nippur, Lhasa, Kish and Susa, dating from approximately 2100 BC through the early second millennium. Each version differs slightly in detail, names added or omitted, reign lengths occasionally varying, dynastic sequences sometimes reordered, but the structure remains constant, the opening formula identical, the impossible longevity of early kings preserved. This textual consistency across centuries and cities suggests something significant about Sumerian record keeping. These weren't independent legendary traditions developing in isolation. They were copies of copies, maintained within a literate scribal tradition that valued continuity. The Sumerian king list wasn't oral folklore crystallized into text. It was an administrative document, updated and preserved by institutions. The most complete version, the Weld-Blundell prism, was excavated at Lhasa in southern Iraq by Herbert Weld-Blundell's expedition. The prism format itself is revealing. 4 sides, each inscribed with 2 columns of text. This allowed the document to be displayed standing upright, readable from all angles. Not a format for casual reading, but for official reference, for consultation, for verification of claims. The text opens with a cosmological statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. The Sumerian phrase is Namlugalan Tadadea, literally, kingship from heaven came down, not metaphorically descended, not symbolically traced. The verb describes physical movement downward, heaven to earth, divine realm to human world, as if kingship were an object, a status, a transferable property that could change location. Eridu, the first city listed, held special significance in Sumerian theology. It was the cult centre of Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water. Sumerian tradition considered Eridu the oldest city, the prototype for all urban civilization. Archaeological excavation confirms occupation dating back to the Ubaid period, before 5000 BC, making it one of the earliest permanent settlements in southern Mesopotamia. When the king list places the origin of kingship at Eridu, it's anchoring political authority in the most ancient, most sacred geography the Sumerians knew. The first 8 kings, the antediluvian rulers, present the interpretive challenge. Alulim, 28,800 years, El-Alengar, 36,000 years, Emenluana, 43,200 years, Emengalana, 28,800 years, the divine Dumuzi, 36,000 years, Ensipaziana, 28,800 years, Ubatutu, 18,600 years, total 241,200 years. Modern chronology cannot accommodate these numbers. The entire span of recorded human history, from the earliest writing to the present, covers only about 5,500 years. Anatomically modern humans emerged around 300,000 years ago, but organised civilization as we recognise it, cities, agriculture, writing, complex social hierarchies, extends back only to roughly 10,000 BCE at most. So these reign lengths aren't just exaggerated, they're categorically impossible. Yet the Sumerian scribes who copied these texts weren't naive. They understood time. They tracked lunar months, solar years, seasonal cycles with sophisticated astronomical precision. They knew how long human lifespans actually lasted. Their administrative documents record the ages of workers, the lengths of building projects, the durations of royal reigns for historical kings. When the texts later list Gilgamesh as ruling for 126 years, or Urnamu for 18 years, the scribes weren't confusing centuries with years or using different calendar systems. So what were they doing with the antediluvian numbers? One scholarly approach suggests these numbers encode sophisticated mathematical patterns. The reign lengths follow specific numerical relationships based on Sumerian sexagesimal 60 mathematics. Some researchers propose the numbers represent not individual years, but something else: astronomical cycles, generations, dynasties. The problem with this interpretation is that the text itself never indicates such encoding. It uses the standard Sumerian term for year mu consistently throughout, both for the impossible antediluvian reigns and the later historical periods. Another approach treats the entire antediluvian section as pure mythology, foundation legends that establish divine origins for political authority but contain zero historical content. In this reading, the purpose isn't to record what actually happened, but to create a cosmic narrative explaining why certain families held power. Every king could point back through this genealogical chain to rulers placed in office directly by the gods. But this interpretation struggles with a crucial detail. The Sumerian king list continues uninterrupted from the antediluvian kings through the flood to the post-diluvian dynasties, and eventually to kings whose existence we can verify archaeologically. There's no textual break, no genre shift, no indication that the document transitions from mythology to history at any particular point. The scribes presented it as a single, continuous genealogical record. Consider the structure after the flood statement. The text reads, "Then the flood swept over." After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. The formula mirrors the opening. Kingship descends from heaven again, but now to a different city. The first king listed in Kish is Gar-Ur, who ruled for 1,000–1,200 years. His successor, Gula-Nidaba Anapad, 960 years. The third king, Palakinatim, 900 years. Still impossible, but decreasing. The pattern continues. By the time the list reaches the first dynasty of Uruk, where Gilgamesh appears, reigns have dropped to between 100 and 1,1200 years. By the third dynasty of around 2000, a period we can historically verify, the reign lengths match reality. Urnamu ruled 18 years, Shulgi ruled 48 years, Amar-Sin ruled 9 years. This progressive shortening suggests the scribes were attempting to bridge a gap between a remote past when rulers lived impossibly long and a historical present where they clearly didn't, between an age when divine human hybrids held power and an age of purely mortal kings. The genealogical chain maintains continuity, but the divine component appears to fade with each generation. The scribal tradition that maintained the Sumerian king list served specific political functions. When new dynasties rose to power, often violently, through conquest, they needed legitimacy. They needed to prove their right to rule wasn't mere military strength, but proper succession. The king list provided that framework. a new king could insert himself into the genealogical sequence, claiming connection to dynasties that stretched back to the gods themselves. But here's what makes this more than simple propaganda: the effort they invested in maintaining continuity. The king list doesn't just assert divine origins for whoever currently holds power. It meticulously traces every dynasty, every city where kingship resided, every king in sequence. It includes defeated dynasties, failed rulers, brief reigns, kings who didn't successfully pass power to heirs. If this were merely propaganda for each successive regime, we'd expect each new version to erase or diminish previous dynasties and glorify the current rulers. Instead, the text preserves them all as necessary links in the chain. The Sumerian scribes who created and maintained this document were doing something more complex than justifying power. They were attempting to preserve institutional memory, to maintain continuity with a past they considered vitally important, a past when kingship came directly from heaven, when rulers carried divine blood, when the connection between gods and humans was closer, more direct, more physical. In practical terms, this meant succession disputes could be resolved by consulting genealogies. It meant certain families had legitimate claims to power based on ancestry, not just capability. It meant the divine component of kingship wasn't symbolic, but hereditary, not earned through virtue or granted through divine inspiration to anyone the gods chose, but inherited, passed down through bloodlines, diluted over time, but still traceable back to its divine origin point. The archaeological context supports this interpretation. The tablets containing the Sumerian king list were found in temple archives and administrative complexes, filed alongside economic records, legal documents, and property deeds, not in libraries with literary works or religious epics. The scribes categorized it as reference material, not entertainment or theology. At Nippur, multiple fragments of the king list were discovered in the scribal quarter, in a building that housed school exercises and scholarly texts. Student scribes copied the king list as part of their training, not because it was great literature, but because it was essential reference material. To be educated meant knowing the succession of legitimate rulers, knowing which dynasties connected to which, knowing the genealogical chains that established current political authority. This institutional importance explains why the text was copied and recopied for over 1,000 years, updated as new kings rose to power, preserved even as empires fell and new peoples conquered the region. The Akkadians, who spoke a different language and eventually dominated Sumer politically, maintained the Sumerian king list. They added their own dynasties to it, but preserved the Sumerian sequence, including the impossible antediluvian kings. Why preserve obvious mythology if you're a conquering power establishing new authority? Unless it wasn't obvious mythology to them. Unless they, too, believed these genealogies documented something real, something that legitimized not just Sumerian kings, but any ruler who could claim connection to that original divine dispensation of authority. The World Blundell Prism represents the culmination of this scribal tradition. Composed during the Isin-Lhasa period, around 1800 BC, it represents the most complete attempt to compile all known dynasties into a single coherent sequence. The scribe who created it, Nur-Ninsuber, signed his name at the end. This wasn't anonymous transmission, it was scholarly work, historiographic compilation, an attempt at comprehensive documentation. What was he documenting? From his perspective, from the perspective of the Sumerian scholarly tradition he represented, he was preserving the genealogical record of divine human rulership. The documentation of how kingship descended from heaven to Eridu, passed through antediluvian dynasties, survived the flood, and continued through successive cities and dynasties down to his own time. A chain of authority reaching back to the gods themselves. Whether that documentation reflects historical reality, mythological creation, or something more ambiguous remains the question we're investigating. But the Sumerian attitude toward this text is clear. They treated it as essential, accurate, and continuous, not as story, but as record. The clay tablets sit in their museum collections, the cuneiform remains readable, and the impossible genealogy persists, preserved with bureaucratic precision, asking us to explain why a sophisticated literate civilization invested so much effort in documenting what we now assume must be fiction, when kingship descended from heaven. The phrase Nam Lugalan Ta-Dadar appears not only in the Sumerian king list, but in multiple other texts from ancient Mesopotamia. This consistency suggests it was a formulaic expression, a technical term, a concept central to how Sumerians understood political authority. To grasp what they meant, we need to examine each word carefully. Nam Lugal combines two elements, Nam indicating abstract status or office, and Lugal meaning great man or king. Together they denote not a specific king, but kingship itself, the institution, the authority, the status. Not kings descended, but kingship descended, the abstract office, not the individual holders of that office. Antar means from heaven or from the sky. An is the Sumerian word for both the sky and An, the sky god who headed the pantheon. The suffix tar indicates origin or source, so kingship came from An, either the sky realm or the sky god himself, the two concepts overlapping in Sumerian thought. D-Day derives from the verb meaning to go out or to come out, combined with directional particles indicating downward movement and completion. The phrase describes something moving from a higher place to a lower place, descending, being lowered, not falling accidentally, but being deliberately brought down. When Sumerian texts state kingship descended from heaven, they're describing a specific event, not a gradual evolution, not a metaphor for social development, a moment when divine authority was transferred from the heavenly realm to the human world. The gods gave kingship to humans deliberately, as a gift or perhaps as a tool, but given, not developed. This concept appears across Mesopotamian literature. In the Sumerian flood story, preserved on tablets CBSN 673 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the text begins with a fragmentary account of creation, followed by the statement, after Anu, Enlil, Enki and Ninhursag had fashioned the dark-headed people, they made animals multiply everywhere, and they made sheep and grain come down from heaven. The text groups kingship, animals, sheep and grain together as things that came down from heaven, all elements of civilization, all provided by divine agency, all transferred from divine realm to earth. The theological implication is significant. Kingship wasn't a human invention. Humans didn't gradually develop leadership structures that gods later sanctioned. Authority originated in heaven, among the gods. The Anunnaki first held royal power in their own realm, then extended it to earth by creating or appointing human rulers to exercise that authority on their behalf. This explains the Sumerian obsession with genealogical legitimacy. If kingship came from heaven as a specific dispensation, then only those rulers properly connected to that original grant held legitimate authority. You couldn't become king merely through strength, intelligence, popular support, or military conquest, though all those might help you seize power. True kingship required connection to the original divine bestowal, genealogical connection, bloodline descent from those first rulers whom the gods directly appointed. The Eridu Genesis text on CBS 10673, though fragmentary, preserves crucial details about this original appointment. After describing creation and the establishment of the first cities, the text states, "Let me institute there the divine plans, let me restore there the brick of the city to its place. He cleansed and purified the holy throne. He cleansed and purified the holy crown. He perfected the holy royal prerogatives. He exercised kingship in the land." At that time the king was Aninlilda. His throne was set up in Eridu. The passage describes kingship as something with physical components, throne, crown, royal prerogatives the Sumerian me will examine later. These aren't metaphors, but objects, attributes, powers, things that can be cleansed, purified, perfected, transferred. The gods instituted the divine plans and placed a king on a throne in Eridu, the first exercise of kingship on earth. But who could hold this office? The text implies not just anyone. The throne, crown, and prerogatives needed to be cleansed and purified before use. This suggests ritual preparation, but also suggests the king himself needed to meet certain requirements. What requirements would qualify a human to exercise authority originally held by gods? Sumerian theology provides an answer. The king needed divine essence, divine component. He couldn't be purely human and hold divine office. He needed to be a hybrid, part god, part human, a being who could bridge the two realms, participate in both divine and human spheres, exercise divine authority among human populations. This isn't speculation imposed by modern interpreters. The text state it explicitly. The Sumerian king list describes several early kings with the prefix dingir, the cuneiform sign that marks divinity. When this sign precedes a name, it indicates the person is a god or possesses divine status. 3 kings in the first dynasty of Uruk carry this designation: the divine Lugalbanda, the divine Dumuzi, and most famously Gilgamesh, whose father was a phantom, the lord of Kulaba. Lugalbanda is called divine directly. Dumuzi, the shepherd god, who later became associated with dying and rising vegetation cycles, appears in the king list as a historical ruler of Uruk. And Gilgamesh, though not marked with the divine determinative in this text, is elsewhere described as 2/3 god and 1/3 human, a being whose very nature consists of measured divine percentage. This mixing of divine and human wasn't considered impossible or metaphorical in Sumerian thought. Their creation accounts describe it happening deliberately. In the text Enki and Ninmah, the gods create humans specifically as workers to relieve divine labour, but the creation process involves divine substance. One version states that humans were formed from clay mixed with the flesh and blood of a slain god. Another version, the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, specifies that the god We-Elu was slaughtered and his intelligence, flesh and blood mixed with clay to create 7 male and 7 female humans. If ordinary humans carried divine blood from creation, diluted but present, then certain humans might carry more concentrated divine heritage, those descended from unions between gods and humans, or from those first humans created directly by gods before reproduction became the mechanism for multiplying the species. This explains the phrase kingship descended from heaven in more literal terms, not metaphorical authority, but actual divine heritage. The office of king required divine blood because exercising divine authority demanded divine capacity. A purely human king couldn't hold the me, couldn't intercede with gods, couldn't perform the sacred functions that maintained cosmic order and earthly prosperity. The position demanded a being who was partially divine. The Sumerian king list's function, then, wasn't simply to list rulers chronologically, it was to document bloodlines, to trace which dynasties maintained sufficient divine heritage to legitimately hold office, to explain how divine percentage changed over time, concentrated in the antediluvian period when gods directly appointed rulers, gradually diluting after the flood as generations passed, and human ancestry mixed with divine. This interpretation makes sense of details that otherwise seem bizarre. Why specify exactly how long antediluvian kings ruled? Because longevity indicated divine heritage. Gods were immortal, humans mortal. A king who ruled 28,800 years must have had substantial divine component. As divine percentage decreased through generations, lifespans shortened accordingly. By the time we reach historical kings with normal human lifespans, the divine component has diluted to trace amounts, enough to maintain legitimacy through genealogical descent, but not enough to manifest in extended life or superhuman capabilities. The flood represents a critical break in this genealogy. Then the flood swept over. One line, the greatest catastrophe in Mesopotamian tradition, described with bureaucratic brevity. But its effect on kingship is profound. After the flood, kingship must be lowered from heaven again. The continuity broke. The bloodlines drowned. Whatever divine human hybrids held power before the flood died, and the gods needed to establish new royal lines with renewed divine component. This explains why the post-Diluvian king lists begin with still impossible but shorter reigns. The divine percentage in the new bloodlines wasn't as concentrated as in the antediluvian period. The gods didn't create new rulers with as much divine component as the first ones. Whether by design or necessity, the second dispensation of kingship involved more human, less divine proportion. Archaeological evidence can neither confirm nor refute these theological claims. We can excavate palaces, temples, royal tombs, we can recover inscriptions, legal codes, economic records, but we cannot excavate bloodlines. We cannot test ancient dinar for divine component. The Sumerian belief in hereditary divine kingship remains precisely that, a belief documented extensively in their texts, enacted in their rituals, embedded in their political structures, but ultimately unprovable by material evidence. What we can confirm is that they believed it, deeply, consistently, across centuries, that their entire political system depended on maintaining these genealogical connections. That disputes over succession hinged on which claimant had better bloodline credentials, that kings spent enormous resources on rituals designed to maintain or restore divine heritage, that scribes meticulously preserved genealogical texts tracing descent from antediluvian dynasties through the flood to contemporary rulers. They weren't play acting. They weren't cynically manipulating populations with myths they themselves didn't believe. The investment, economic, architectural, literary, ritual was too substantial for mere theatre. The Sumerians built their civilization on the claim that kingship descended from heaven, and they organised everything accordingly. Whether kingship actually descended from heaven, whether divine human hybrids genuinely held power in antediluvian times, whether the gods really appointed specific bloodlines to rule on their behalf, these questions remain open. What isn't open to doubt is that the Sumerians structured their entire society around affirmative answers to those questions. The phrase Nam, Lugu, Untadada wasn't poetic flourish. It was constitutional foundation. It was the theological and genealogical claim that justified why some families ruled and others obeyed, why certain rituals were essential, why the king wasn't simply the strongest warrior or the best administrator, but a being whose very bloodline connected earth to heaven. The implications ripple outward from that core claim. If kingship descended from heaven, then studying Sumerian rule texts isn't just learning ancient politics, it's examining a civilization's documentation of something they believed to be cosmically significant, the ongoing presence of divine heritage in human bloodlines, carefully maintained, meticulously tracked, and perpetually in danger of dilution. The antediluvian problem: 8 kings, 5 cities, 241,200 years. The antediluvian section of the Sumerian king list refuses to disappear through interpretive charity. Scholars have applied every available hermeneutic approach, mathematical encoding, astronomical cycles, mythological symbolism, political propaganda, scribal error, textual corruption, and the numbers remain stubbornly impossible, yet precise. Let's examine exactly what the text claims. The World-Blundell Prism states, after kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Elulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Alongar ruled for 36,000 years. 2 kings, they ruled for 64,800 years. The pattern continues through Bod to Bera, 3 kings, 108,000 years. Larak, 1 king, 28,800 years. Sippa, 1 king, 21,000 years. And Shuruppak, 1 king, 18,600 years. Then 5 cities, 8 kings ruled for 241,200 years. Then the flood swept over. The numbers aren't random. They're all multiples of 3,600. Some scholars note that 3,600 was significant in Sumerian mathematics. Written as a single cuneiform sign, it represented a R, a fundamental unit in their sexagesimal system. Alulim's reign of 28,800 years equals 8R. Alalengar's 36,000 years equals 10R. The total 241,200 years equals 67R. Does this mathematical elegance suggest encoding? Perhaps these numbers represent something other than years, generations multiplied by a factor, astronomical cycles, dynastic periods. The problem is that the text uses the standard Sumerian term for year mu consistently. The same word appears in both antediluvian and historical sections. If the scribes meant something different for the antediluvian period, they gave no textual indication of that difference. Moreover, the pattern of decreasing reign lengths suggests the scribes were trying to bridge from impossible to possible, not encode hidden meaning. If these were pure symbols or mathematical relationships, why make them decrease? Why not maintain consistent cosmic numerology throughout? The decreasing pattern implies the scribes were attempting to account for change over time, from an age when rulers lived impossibly long to an age when they didn't. Let's consider the alternative. They meant exactly what they wrote. 8 kings ruled for 241,200 years before the flood. This requires us to ask, what did they think they were recording? The most literal interpretation, they were documenting the reigns of divine or semi-divine beings who possessed lifespans incomprehensible to normal humans. In this reading, the antediluvian kings weren't humans with exaggerated ages, but beings of a different nature entirely. Gods, or god-king hybrids, placed in charge of humanity's first cities. Their extended lifespans indicated their divine component, their closeness to the immortal gods. This interpretation aligns with creation accounts, stating that humans were created as servants for the gods. If gods needed human workers, but wanted to supervise those workers directly, they might appoint overseers who were divine enough to live for vast periods, but human enough to interact with mortal populations. Beings who could bridge the divine-human divide not just theologically, but biologically. The flood, then, represents not just a catastrophe, but a rupture in this arrangement. Whatever beings held power before the flood died, their divine component insufficient to grant full immortality, their human component making them vulnerable to physical death. After the flood, the gods appointed new rulers, but with less divine substance. The post-diluvian kings' shorter lifespans reflected their lesser divine percentage. But this raises an obvious question. Why would the gods reduce divine component in post-diluvian rulers? Why not maintain the same proportion as before? One possible answer from the texts: divine-human hybrids caused problems. The Eridu Genesis and other Mesopotamian flood accounts describe the gods sending the deluge because humanity became too numerous, too noisy, too troublesome. What if the problem wasn't purely human population, but the proliferation of divine-human hybrids? What if beings with divine heritage but human independence created instability the gods decided to eliminate? This interpretation finds support in other ancient Near Eastern traditions. The biblical text in Genesis 6 describes Nephilim in the earth in those days, when sons of God came to daughters of men and had children. The passage directly precedes the flood narrative and explicitly states that this divine-human mixing prompted God's decision to destroy humanity. The connection between hybrid beings and divine judgment appears across multiple traditions. Returning to the Sumerian king list, after the flood, the divine percentage in rulers clearly decreases. First dynasty of Kish reigns from 1200 to 600 years. First dynasty of Uruk, 1200 to 126 years. By the third dynasty of Ur, reigns match human lifespans, 18 to 48 years. The pattern suggests intentional dilution, a policy decision by the gods to maintain some divine heritage in ruling bloodlines, but prevent the concentration that existed before the flood. Another approach treats the antediluvian numbers as institutional memory of remote prehistory, preserved in corrupted form. Perhaps these kings represent entire dynasties, and the years represent generations or centuries. Perhaps actual prehistoric rulers held power for normal lifespans, but later scribes, compiling oral traditions from the deep past, inflated or misunderstood the chronology. The specificity of the numbers could reflect authentic tradition. These really were the numbers preserved in oral memory, but the meaning of those numbers had been lost or transformed in transmission. This explanation is appealing because it allows the texts to contain historical kernels without accepting impossible claims, but it struggles with the text's own presentation. Sumerian scribes were sophisticated historians. They distinguished between myth and history in other contexts. They compiled king lists for their own historical periods with accurate, verifiable chronologies, yet they chose to present the antediluvian period in the same format, using the same terminology, maintaining the same genealogical continuity. They had the opportunity to frame these early kings differently, as legendary figures, as mythological beings, as something distinct from historical rulers. They didn't. They presented continuous succession from antediluvian to historical periods without textual break or genre shift. We should also consider the possibility that the antediluvian section served primarily ideological functions. New dynasties rising to power needed legitimacy. Claiming descent from rulers who held power for 28,800 years provided impressive credentials. The impossibility of the claims made them unfalsifiable. Who could prove your family didn't descend from Alulim of Eridu? The antediluvian section created a mythological charter, a foundation narrative that any Sumerian dynasty could claim connection to through carefully crafted genealogies. Yet this explanation doesn't account for the strange specificity. If you're inventing mythological charters, why use numbers that are obviously impossible? Why not claim early kings ruled for 100 years or 500 years, long but not absurd? Why create numbers that invite skepticism? The antediluvian reign lengths are so impossible they defeat their own supposed propagandistic purpose. A shrewd political fabricator would create more believable claims, unless believability wasn't the goal. Unless the scribes were preserving numbers they received from earlier tradition, numbers they themselves might not have fully understood, but felt obligated to maintain accurately. Ancient scribes often preserved material they found problematic, adding explanatory glosses or interpretive notes, but leaving the source text unchanged. Perhaps the antediluvian numbers represent this phenomenon, archaic data preserved because it was traditional, even though later scribes found it challenging. The comparison with other cultures' flood traditions is instructive. Mesopotamian flood accounts appear in multiple forms: the Sumerian Eridu Genesis, the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, the flood tablet from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the late Babylonian era epic. Each version varies in detail, but all agree on core elements. The gods sent a flood to destroy humanity. One man was warned and built a vessel. Life survived and repopulated the earth. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek around 290 BC, recorded Mesopotamian tradition for Hellenistic audiences. His account lists 10 antediluvian kings, not 8 as in Sumerian versions, but preserves the pattern of impossibly long reigns totaling 432,000 years in one manuscript tradition. The inflation from 241,200 to 432,000 suggests textual evolution, but the core pattern persists. Before the flood, kings ruled for periods incomprehensible to later humans. Biblical tradition in Genesis lists 10 patriarchs from Adam to Noah, with lifespans declining from Adam's 930 years to Noah's 950 years, then dropping sharply to Abraham's 175 years, and eventually to normal human ranges. The pattern parallels Sumerian tradition, antediluvian period with extended lifespans, catastrophic flood, post-diluvian period with decreasing lifespans until reaching normal human ranges. Different numbers, different names, but the same structural pattern. This cross-cultural similarity suggests these traditions might preserve memory of actual prehistoric events, though the details have been mythologized beyond historical recovery. Or it might indicate that flood myths naturally develop along similar narrative lines when cultures facing flood risks create theological explanations for catastrophe and rebuild. Distinguishing between these possibilities using only textual evidence is probably impossible. What we can say with confidence, the Sumerian scribes who maintained the king list treated the antediluvian section seriously. They updated other portions of the text as new dynasties rose to power, but they preserved the antediluvian sequence unchanged across centuries. They filed the document with administrative records, not with mythological epics. They taught it to student scribes as essential knowledge, not entertaining fiction. Whatever we make of the impossible numbers, the Sumerians themselves appeared to accept them as accurate documentation. They weren't embarrassed by the claims. They didn't rationalize or explain them away. They recorded them with bureaucratic precision and transmitted them with scholarly care. The antediluvian problem remains unsolved. 8 kings ruling for 241,200 years cannot be literally true by any understanding of human history or biology we possess. But the Sumerian commitment to preserving these numbers, their integration into political legitimacy systems, their continuity with later genealogies we can verify archaeologically, all of this suggests the text meant something more complex than simple fiction. Whether that something was encoded knowledge, corrupted tradition, theological charter, or attempted documentation of realities we can't access from this historical distance remains the question. The clay tablets preserve the claim, the cuneiform doesn't explain itself, and the impossible numbers sit there, recorded with the same meticulous care as grain shipments and tax receipts, asking to be accounted for. The blood that mattered. The Sumerian creation account, Enki and Ninmah, begins not with cosmic voids or primordial chaos, but with labour dispute. The young gods, the Anunnaki, were forced to dig canals, excavate riverbeds, perform the heavy work of establishing civilization in Mesopotamia. The text states, in those days, in the days when heaven and earth were created, in those nights, in the nights when heaven and earth were created, in those years. In the years when the fates were determined, when the Anunnaki gods were born, when the goddesses were taken in marriage, when the goddesses were distributed in heaven and earth, when the goddesses had to undergo childbirth, when the gods had to dig the canals, when the gods had to excavate the watercourses, then the gods dug the Tigris River and next the Euphrates. The gods, having performed all this work, exhausted and spent, had to undergo hard labour. The Anunnaki complained to Nama, the primordial mother goddess. She brings their complaint to her son Enki, god of wisdom, who sleeps in the deep waters of the Abzu. The text describes her rousing him, my son, rise from your bed. When you have worked your skill, fashion servants for the gods so that they can produce their equals. Notice the phrase, produce their equals. The humans to be created aren't just workers, but beings capable of reproduction, of multiplying, of sustaining their population without divine intervention. But the creation process itself requires divine substance. The text states, Enki reached for the good princely clay lying in the subterranean waters. He spoke to his mother Nama, my mother, the creature you planned will really come into existence. Impose on it the work of carrying baskets. You should knead it from the clay of the watery depths. Ninmah will work with you. Ninhusag, Ninimma, Shuziana, Ninmada, Ninshara and Nimbara will assist you in your task. Ninmah, my mother, will stand by at your delivery. When she will have fixed its destiny, you will give it life as a worker. The creation process involves Ninmah shaping the clay, while Enki provides something essential. Though the text is fragmentary here, other versions specify what that essential component is. The Akkadian Atrahasis epic, which draws on Sumerian tradition, states explicitly, "Let them slaughter one god, and let the gods be purified by immersion. With his flesh and blood, let Nintu mix the clay." The god to be slaughtered is Weilu, described as a god who possessed rationality. His blood and flesh are mixed with clay to create humans. The text continues, "From the god's flesh and blood, Nintu mixed clay. For the rest of time they would hear the drum. From the flesh of the god, the spirit remained. It would make the living know its sign. Lest he be allowed to be forgotten, the spirit remained. This is creation through sacrifice. Divine essence transferred to human bodies through the literal mixing of godly substance with earthly clay. The result isn't purely divine, that would create more gods, and it isn't purely earthly, that would create mere animals. It's hybrid, a being with divine spirit, divine intelligence, divine rationality, combined with mortal flesh, earthly limitations, vulnerability to death. The theological implications are profound. Humans in Sumerian thought aren't merely created by gods, they contain gods, diluted, diminished, fragmented, but present. The divine blood mixed into the first human's clay means every human carries trace divine heritage, not metaphorically, not spiritually, biologically, in Sumerian understanding. The life force, the intelligence, the capacity for civilization all derive from that original divine component mixed into the clay. But if all humans carry divine blood from creation, why do some, kings specifically, claim special divine ancestry? The answer lies in concentration and preservation. The original humans created by Enki and Ninmah possess the highest concentration of divine essence. As generations passed and humans reproduced among themselves, that divine component diluted, spread across expanding populations, weakened through mixture with purely human bloodlines. Certain lineages, however, maintained higher concentrations. How? Through continued divine human contact, through unions between gods and humans that refreshed the divine percentage, through rituals that restored or preserved divine essence, through careful marriage practices that kept sacred bloodlines from diluting too rapidly. This is where kingship enters the biological framework. Kings weren't just any humans. They descended from lineages that maintained special divine concentration. The antediluvian kings in the Sumerian king list represent the earliest generations, closest to the original creation, carrying the highest divine percentage, manifesting that heritage through impossible longevity. The text Enki and Ninmah contains another crucial detail. After creating normal humans, Enki and Ninmah have a drunken competition where they create various imperfect humans, beings with disabilities, deformities, unusual characteristics. Ninmah creates 6 such beings. Enki finds purposes for each. Then Enki creates a being and challenges Ninmah to find a purpose for it. She cannot. The text is damaged here, but the implication is clear. Creating humans wasn't simple repetitive work. Each creation involves specific divine choices about what qualities, capabilities, and limitations to build in. If gods could create humans with different capabilities, some strong, some weak, some intelligent, some impaired, then gods could also create humans with different levels of divine essence. Perhaps the first humans created to be workers carried minimal divine component, just enough for intelligence and tool use. But perhaps other humans, created specifically to serve as intermediaries or overseers, received higher concentrations of divine blood. created not as labourers, but as rulers, as god-kings. This would explain the antediluvian dynasties. The first rulers weren't descendants of the worker humans created in Enki and Ninmah. They were separately created beings with much higher divine percentages, placed in authority over human populations. Their extended lifespans reflected their greater divine component. Their role as kings derived not from political development, but from their nature as divine human hybrids created specifically for that function. The flood destroyed these hybrid rulers along with most of humanity. When kingship was lowered from heaven again after the deluge, the gods created or appointed new rulers, but with reduced divine component. Perhaps the pre-flood experiment with highly divine hybrids had proven problematic. These beings might have become too powerful, too independent, threatening divine authority. The post-flood royal bloodlines maintained enough divine essence for legitimacy and for performing sacred functions, but not enough to challenge the gods. This framework explains the Sumerian obsession with royal bloodlines. If divine component diluted over generations through ordinary reproduction, then maintaining kingship within specific families preserved higher concentrations of sacred blood. Marrying outside the royal lineage meant further dilution. The pattern we see in Sumerian royal marriages, kings marrying sisters, half-sisters, close relatives, wasn't just political alliance or cultural preference. It was biological strategy. Concentrate the divine blood, prevent dilution, preserve the sacred percentage that legitimized rulership. The biological understanding of divine ancestry also explains rituals we'll examine later, specifically the sacred marriage ceremony where kings ritually united with representatives of Inanna. These weren't purely symbolic acts, but believed to be actual mechanisms for restoring or concentrating divine essence in royal bloodlines. The goddess, through her priestess, physically transmitted divine substance to the king, refreshing his divine component, ensuring his heirs would carry sufficient sacred blood to legitimately hold office. Modern readers might dismiss this as primitive biology, pre-scientific misunderstanding of heredity and reproduction. But we should recognize that the Sumerians were observing actual patterns. Children resemble parents, certain traits run in families, some lineages produce capable leaders generation after generation, while others don't. Without modern genetics, the Sumerians developed a theological biological framework that explained these observations: divine blood, originally mixed into human clay at creation, passed through generations, concentrated in some families more than others, and manifested in thee. Capabilities, intellectual, physical, spiritual, that suited certain individuals for kingship. The clay tablets preserve this understanding in multiple texts. Creation accounts explaining how divine blood entered humanity. King lists documenting which lineages carried concentrated divine heritage. Ritual texts describing ceremonies to maintain or restore sacred bloodlines. Legal codes establishing that kings with proper divine ancestry held unique authority to create laws and render judgment. Hymns where kings claimed divine parentage, divine birth, divine nursing by goddesses. Was any of this literally true? Could human bodies contain measurably different levels of divine essence? Did the gods actually create hybrid rulers with extended lifespans and superhuman capabilities? From modern scientific perspectives, these claims fall outside observable reality. We have no evidence that any humans ever lived 28,800 years. We have no mechanism by which divine substance could be mixed with biological materials. We understand heredity through genetics, not divine blood percentages. But the Sumerians didn't have microscopes, DNA sequencing, or genetic theory. They had observed reality. Some families consistently produced capable rulers. Some individuals demonstrated abilities beyond normal human range. Bloodlines mattered profoundly in determining who held power. Their framework of divine blood mixed into human clay at creation, concentrated in royal families, preserved through careful marriage and ritual practices, this framework made sense of their observations. It was functional biology for their cultural context, and it had profound political consequences. If kingship required divine blood, then revolution became not just political, but biological impossibility. You couldn't overthrow a dynasty and claim legitimate authority unless you possessed the requisite divine percentage. Conquest might win territory, but divine bloodline was non-transferable except through reproduction. This explains why successful conquerors so frequently married into the dynasties they defeated, acquiring, through marriage, the divine legitimacy they couldn't claim through military victory alone. The Sumerian creation accounts weren't abstract theology. They were the biological and political foundation of their entire civilization. They explained why humans existed to earth, what humans were made of, K plus divine, and why some humans ruled while others obeyed detention of divine essence in specific bloodlines. The text documented not just what gods did in mythological time, but the ongoing biological reality they believed governed human society. The clay preserves these texts. The cuneiform doesn't explain whether the claims are true, but it documents with meticulous care a civilization's understanding that kingship wasn't political development, but biological inheritance, that certain families carried sacred blood. That divine ancestry was real, measurable, and essential for legitimate authority. Whether we believe those claims is secondary to recognizing that they believed them and organized their entire political system accordingly. 2/3 divine. The Epic of Gilgamesh introduces its hero with precise mathematical specification. 2/3 of him is God, 1/3 of him is human. The standard Babylonian version, compiled by the scribe Sinleki-Uninni around 1200 BC from earlier Sumerian sources, repeats this formula multiple times. It's not casual description or poetic exaggeration, it's fractional calculation, divine percentage. How does one become 2/3 divine and 1/3 human? The mathematics are impossible, or at least highly unusual. Gilgamesh's father was Lugalbanda, described in the Sumerian king list as the divine Lugalbanda, the shepherd. His mother was Ninsun, the wild cow goddess, also called Lady Wild Cow. One divine parent and one human parent produce offspring that is half divine, half human, standard heredity. But the text insists Gilgamesh was 2/3 divine. Scholars have proposed various solutions. Perhaps Lugalbanda, though described as divine, was actually semi-divine himself, 1/3 human. Combined with a fully divine mother, this produces 2/3 divine offspring. But this requires reading information into the text that isn't explicitly stated. The Sumerian sources treat Lugalbanda's divine status as complete, not partial. Another proposal, the 2/3 divine formula, isn't mathematical but poetic, a way of saying very divine without claiming full divinity. The problem with this interpretation is that Sumerian and Akkadian texts were perfectly capable of saying very or mostly or almost entirely divine if they meant that. They chose specific fractions. They calculated divine percentages. The precision suggests they meant something precise. A third interpretation draws on the text statement that Gilgamesh was nursed by multiple goddesses. The Epic of Gilgamesh mentions Ninsun as his mother and goddess Ramut-Ninsun as his nurse. Some versions reference additional divine caretakers. If divine essence could be transferred through nursing, through literally ingesting divine milk, then Gilgamesh might have received additional divine component beyond his parent age. Born half divine, but elevated to 2/3 divine through divine nursing. This interpretation aligns with broader Mesopotamian beliefs about divine substances. Gods possess qualities that could be physically transferred. Their flesh could be eaten, their blood mixed with clay, their milk nursed by privileged humans. Sacred meals featuring divine food or drink appear frequently in temple rituals. The concept wasn't alien to Sumerian thought. Consuming divine substances increased your own divine component. But the most intriguing solution comes from a 1998 scholarly article by Joan Goodnick Westenholz titled The Genealogy of Gilgamesh. Westenholz proposes that the 2/3 divine calculation accounts for both parents and nurse. Ninsun, the mother, provides 1/3. Lugalbanda, whether divine or semi-divine, provides a 2/3, and the divine nurse, through supernatural nursing, provides the final third, though Gilgamesh remains part human through his father's human component or through his own embodiment in mortal flesh. The mathematics still don't resolve cleanly, but the attempt to calculate divine percentage reveals something significant. The Sumerians believed divine heritage could be quantified, not merely present or absent, not vaguely descended from gods, but measurable in fractions, trackable across generations, subject to mathematical analysis. This makes Gilgamesh's character in the epic particularly interesting. He demonstrates superhuman capabilities, impossible strength, ability to defeat the Bull of Heaven, journey to the ends of the earth, dive to the bottom of the cosmic ocean. But he also dies. His divine 2/3 grants exceptional abilities, but not immortality. That final third of human nature dooms him to mortality despite his sacred ancestry. The entire epic revolves around this tension. Gilgamesh, grieving for his friend Enkidu, embarks on a quest for immortality. He seeks out Utnapishtim, the flood survivor whom the gods granted eternal life. Gilgamesh's journey is motivated by his awareness that despite his divine percentage, he will die like any human. His 2/3 divinity isn't enough. The 1/3 humanity wins. This narrative reflects the Sumerian understanding of royal bloodlines. Kings carried divine blood, often in substantial percentages. That heritage granted them capabilities beyond normal humans: wisdom, strength, longevity, ability to communicate with gods, authority to perform sacred rituals. But even the most divine kings eventually died. The human component, however small, meant mortality. Divine percentage might extend life, enhance abilities, legitimate authority, but it couldn't confer full immortality. The Sumerian king list demonstrates this pattern. Lugalbanda, Gilgamesh's father, ruled for 1,100 years according to the list. Gilgamesh himself ruled for 126 years. His son Ur-Nungol ruled for 30 years. The divine percentage clearly diluted with each generation. Lugalbanda's extended reign indicated substantial divine component. Gilgamesh's shorter but still reign indicated less divine heritage, specifically 2/3 versus his father's higher percentage. Ur-Nungol's near-human lifespan suggested the bloodline had diluted to minimal divine component by the 3rd generation. This generational dilution created an ongoing problem for royal dynasties. Divine blood, the source of legitimate kingship, naturally weakened over time. Each generation, unless refreshed through new divine contact, carried less sacred essence than the previous generation. Within a few generations, a dynasty that began with substantially divine kings might produce rulers whose divine percentage had dropped to levels indistinguishable from common humans. This explains the Sumerian emphasis on rituals to maintain divine contact. Kings couldn't allow their bloodlines to dilute to purely human levels. They needed mechanisms to restore, preserve, or at least slow the degradation of divine percentage. Sacred marriage ceremonies where kings united with divine representatives. Temple rituals where kings received divine blessings directly from gods. Consultation of divine will through dreams, omens, oracles. All of these practices served not just religious or political functions, but biological ones, maintaining the divine component in royal blood. Gilgamesh's two-thirds divinity also raises questions about earlier kings. If Gilgamesh was two-thirds divine and ruled for 126 years, what divine percentage did antediluvian kings possess who ruled for 28,800 years? The mathematics suggests they must have been nearly entirely divine, perhaps 95% or 99% divine, with only trace human components. Essentially gods incarnated in barely human form, appointed by other gods to rule over purely human populations. After the flood, when kingship was lowered from heaven again, the gods apparently decided not to create such highly divine rulers. The first post-Diluvian kings, with reigns around 1200 years, seem to have been granted perhaps 75% or 80% divine essence, enough for extended life and superhuman capabilities, but far below the antediluvian percentages. By Gilgamesh's generation, divine percentages had dropped to two-thirds through generational dilution. This framework transforms the Sumerian king list from mythology into biological documentation. The decreasing reign lengths track decreasing divine percentages across generations. The list documents not just who ruled, but the genetic degradation of divine bloodlines over time. It's a genealogical record showing how sacred heritage, originally concentrated in the antediluvian dynasties, gradually diluted through post-flood generations until reaching levels barely distinguishable from common humanity. Could the Sumerians actually detect these different levels of divine blood? What observable traits would indicate higher versus lower divine percentage? The text suggests several markers. Longevity, hunger, life got more divine, physical capabilities and strength more divine, wisdom, exceptional intelligence got more divine, and most importantly, success, prosperity, military victory, architectural achievement, divine favour, indicating proper bloodline. This created a somewhat circular system. Kings with proper divine ancestry ruled successfully because God supported them. Kings who ruled successfully must have proper divine ancestry because otherwise gods wouldn't support them. Unsuccessful kings defeated dynasties, collapsed cities. These all indicated insufficient divine blood. Weak bloodlines, divine percentage degraded below functional levels. The system also created potential for usurpation claims. If a new dynasty conquered an old one, they could argue the old dynasty's divine blood had become too diluted to maintain divine support. The conquest itself proved the defeated kings lacked sufficient divine percentage. The victors, by succeeding, demonstrated they possessed greater divine essence, perhaps through a different genealogical line tracing to different antediluvian or divine ancestors. Gilgamesh's two-thirds divinity represents the ideal balance from the Sumerian perspective. Enough divine heritage for superhuman capabilities and legitimate authority. Enough human nature to relate to human subjects and understand human needs, not so divine as to be distant from humanity, not so human as to lack sacred legitimacy. The perfect god-king formula. Yet even this optimal percentage couldn't prevent death. The epic's tragedy lies precisely in Gilgamesh's awareness that his two-thirds divinity is insufficient for the one thing he desperately wants, immortality. He possesses everything except the one attribute that distinguishes gods from humans. The one-third humanity in his nature condemns him to the grave. His quest to Utnapishtim reveals the answer he doesn't want to hear. Immortality was granted to the flood survivor as unique exception, never to be repeated. The gods have decided to maintain the divine human boundary. Even kings with substantial divine percentages will die. Divine blood grants temporary advantages, longer life, greater capabilities, legitimate authority, but ultimate mortality remains inevitable. This theological framework had profound psychological effects. Sumerian kings lived with the knowledge that they carried sacred blood but remained mortal. Their divine percentage made them special, elevated them above common humans, justified their authority, but couldn't save them from death. They were trapped between human and divine, participating in both natures, belonging fully to neither. The Gilgamesh epic explores this existential position with remarkable sophistication. The hero's two-thirds divine, one-third human nature isn't just mathematical detail, it's the core of his character. His superhuman strength comes from divine blood. His inevitable death comes from human flesh. The fraction defines his capabilities and his limitations. The calculation determines his destiny. Whether the Sumerians actually believed divine percentage could be calculated mathematically, or whether the two-thirds formula was metaphorical expression of substantial but not total divinity. The texts treat it with quantitative precision. They calculated divine ancestry like an equation. They tracked it across generations like hereditary trait. They documented it in king lists and epic narratives as measurable, traceable reality. The clay tablets preserve these calculations. The cuneiform doesn't explain if the mathematics made biological sense, but it records with careful specificity that Gilgamesh was two-thirds god, one-third human, that this fraction mattered. The ancient scribes considered divine percentage calculable, trackable, and essential for understanding who could legitimately rule and why. The sacred marriage chamber. In the temple complex at Uruk, at the highest level of the ziggurat dedicated to Inanna, stood a room prepared with ritual specificity. Bedcloths, incense, sacred furniture. Once per year, during the New Year festival, the king of Uruk would ascend to this chamber. Waiting there would be a priestess, the high priestess of Inanna, embodying the goddess herself for this ritual purpose. What happened in that room was considered essential for the prosperity of the kingdom, the fertility of the land, and, most significantly for our investigation, the maintenance of divine bloodline in the royal family. Scholars call this the sacred marriage, or hieroskamos, Greek term for sacred union. Cuneiform texts describe the ritual in remarkable detail, though modern translators often treat the explicit sexual content as metaphorical. But the texts themselves speak plainly. This wasn't symbolic marriage. It was physical union between the king and the embodied goddess, performed to renew the king's divine mandate and, in Sumerian understanding, to refresh the divine component in royal bloodlines. The ritual appears in multiple text sources. The Idin Dagon hymn from around 1900 BC describes the sacred marriage in detail. Idin Dagon was a king of Isin who ruled briefly around 1974-1954 BCA. The hymn, written in Sumerian, narrates the preparation for hieroskamos. For the wild cow, for the goddess Inanna, he has purified the bed. He has darkened the room with cedar resin. He has sprinkled the bed with oil. When the king with head high approaches the holy loins, of Inanna, Inanna, receiving him with pleasure, embraces him. The text continues with explicit description of the sexual act, then states the purpose. May the heart of the land be soothed. May your city be sound. May good fortune and favourable destiny be determined. May the prosperity of the land be granted. The connection is direct. The king's physical union with Inanna, through her representative priestess, produces tangible results: prosperity, fertility, divine favour. But underlying these effects was the Sumerian belief in biological transfer. The goddess, through sexual union, transmitted divine essence to the king. She refreshed his divine blood. She reinforced the sacred percentage that legitimized his rule. Another text, the Blessing of Shulgi, describes the aftermath of sacred marriage. After the king has received the blessing of Inanna, after his strength has been confirmed, after divine power has been granted to him, he shall go forth to rule. His word shall be obeyed. His enemies shall fall before him. The blessing isn't metaphorical divine approval. It's the transfer of divine power, in Sumerian Namdingir, literally divine ness, or godhood. The king receives this power physically through the sacred marriage act. His strength is confirmed, literally re-established, renewed, restored. The ritual doesn't merely symbolise divine support, it actively maintains the king's divine component at functional levels. This makes biological sense within Sumerian theological framework. If divine blood diluted over generations, then kings needed mechanisms to counter that dilution. Sacred marriage provided one such mechanism. The goddess, fully divine, transmitted her essence to the king through sexual union. The divine substance literally entered his body, mixing with his bloodstream, reinforcing the percentage inherited from his ancestors. Modern readers might see this as primitive fertility ritual or political theatre, but the Sumerians invested enormous resources in these ceremonies. The temple architecture specifically included sacred marriage chambers. Priestesses underwent extensive training to properly embody the goddess. Kings couldn't skip or delegate this ritual. It required the king himself, in person, performing the act at the appointed time. The costs and logistics were substantial. The New Year festival lasted days. The entire court relocated to the temple complex. Animals were sacrificed. Sacred meals prepared. Ritual purifications performed, all building toward the climactic moment when king and goddess united physically. This wasn't casual symbolism. It was institutional infrastructure supporting what Sumerians considered biological necessity. The role of the high priestess deserves attention. She wasn't merely a ritual functionary. She was carefully selected, extensively trained, ritually consecrated to serve as Inanna's earthly embodiment. During the sacred marriage, Sumerian theology held that Inanna literally inhabited the priestess's body. The goddess became physically present, using the priestess as her vessel. The king wasn't having sex with a woman pretending to be a goddess. He was uniting with the goddess herself, who temporarily manifested in human form. This explains why certain women in Sumerian society held such high status. The Ninding Year-Hod and Lukul weren't victims of temple exploitation. They were essential biological intermediaries. Through their bodies, divine essence could be transmitted to human recipients. They served as channels connecting divine and human realms, allowing the transfer of sacred substances that maintained royal bloodlines. The transmission worked both ways. If divine blood could be strengthened through sacred marriage, it could also be diluted through improper unions. Kings who married women lacking divine heritage risked producing heirs with insufficient sacred percentage. This explains the complex marriage politics in Sumerian royal families. Kings often had multiple wives, but the chief wife, the one whose sons would inherit, needed to possess proper lineage herself. Sumerian records show kings frequently marrying half-sisters, first cousins, or women from other royal families with documented divine ancestry. These weren't merely political alliances, they were genetic strategies. Concentrate the divine blood, marry within families that carried sacred percentage, produce heirs with sufficient divine component to legitimately hold office. The sacred marriage ritual supplemented but couldn't entirely replace hereditary considerations. A king with weak divine bloodline couldn't restore full legitimacy merely through hierosgamos. The ritual refreshed existing divine component but couldn't create it ex nihilo. This meant dynasties needed to maintain baseline divine percentage through careful marriage practices, using sacred marriage to periodically reinforce that baseline against generational dilution. Archaeological evidence supports the importance of these rituals. The Inanna temple complex at Uruk, dedicated to Inanna, includes architectural features consistent with sacred marriage chambers. Excavations have uncovered ritual beds, sacred furniture, and inscriptions describing preparation for hierosgamos. The physical infrastructure existed to support what texts describe. Other Mesopotamian cities replicated this pattern. At Ur, the Temple of Nanna included similar chambers. At Lagash, texts describe sacred marriage between the king and Baal-Ru. At Isin, Idin Dagon's sacred marriage texts describe elaborate ceremonies. The practice wasn't unique to Uruk or Inanna. Every major Sumerian city-state incorporated sacred marriage into its religious political system. The question of priestess pregnancy naturally arises. If these unions were physical, what happened when children resulted? Sumerian texts rarely address this directly, but scattered references suggest such children held special status. Some scholars believe certain high-ranking temple officials were offspring of sacred marriages, children of goddess and king, carrying extremely concentrated divine blood. These children couldn't inherit the throne. Succession followed patrilineal descent from the king's legitimate wives, but they might serve as priests, temple administrators, or royal advisors. Their unique parentage, divine mother, through possessed priestess, royal father, gave them sacred percentage without political claim. They could serve as intermediaries, oracles, ritual specialists, roles requiring high divine component, but not threatening dynastic succession. The biological framework also explains why some dynasties proved more successful than others. A dynasty that maintained sacred marriage practices, married properly within royal bloodlines, and produced heirs with sufficient divine percentage would rule successfully for generations. Gods would support them because their bloodlines remained properly divine. But a dynasty that neglected sacred marriage, married inappropriately outside royal lines, or allowed divine blood to dilute too severely, would lose divine support. Their diminished sacred percentage would manifest in military defeat, natural disasters, economic collapse, signs the gods had withdrawn favour because the royal bloodline no longer met minimum divine requirements. This wasn't abstract theology, it was practical political biology in Sumerian understanding. Divine blood required active maintenance. Passive inheritance alone couldn't preserve adequate percentages across multiple generations. Kings needed to participate in rituals that refreshed their divine component. They needed to marry strategically to prevent dilution. They needed to produce heirs whose sacred percentage remained high enough for legitimate authority. The sacred marriage chamber at Uruk's pinnacle represented this system's core mechanism. In that room, once annually, the boundary between human and divine temporarily dissolved. The goddess manifested in flesh. The king united with divinity. Divine essence transferred physically from heavenly to earthly realm. And the royal bloodline received the reinforcement needed to maintain its sacred percentage for another year. Whether any biological transfer actually occurred is unknowable. Modern biology provides no mechanism for divine essence transmitted through sexual union. But the Sumerians believed it happened. They organised major festivals around it. They built specialised architecture to house it. They trained priestesses for years to facilitate it. They considered it essential for maintaining the divine bloodlines that legitimised kingship. The clay tablets preserve the ritual texts. The cuneiform doesn't explain the biology, but it documents in explicit detail that Sumerian kings physically united with goddesses to refresh their divine ancestry, that this union was neither metaphorical nor symbolic, but actual physical contact, that the purpose was to maintain sacred bloodlines. That kingship required not just proving divine ancestry, but actively preserving it through ritual practice. The sacred marriage chamber stands empty now, ruins exposed to weather, tourists photographing the ziggurats' remains. But in those chambers, for over 1,000 years, Sumerian kings enacted rituals they believed essential for preserving the divine percentage that made kingship possible. Gudea's dream of appointment. In the later 3rd millennium BC, around 2144-2124 BC, a ruler named Gudea governed the city-state of Lagash in southern Mesopotamia. He wasn't a great conqueror. He didn't expand Lagash's territory significantly, But he left behind some of the most extensive royal inscriptions from the entire Sumerian period, 2 large clay cylinders, now housed in the Louvre Museum in Paris, containing over 1,400 lines of cuneiform text describing his divine appointment to build a temple. Cylinder A and Cylinder B tell a remarkable story. Not a story of political achievement or military victory, but of direct divine communication establishing Gudur's legitimacy through supernatural encounter. The text begins with Gudur anxious about interpreting dream signs. He has received a vision but doesn't understand its meaning. He consults his goddess mother, Getumdu, and receives permission to visit Nanshe, goddess of dream interpretation. The text describes his journey and his recounting of the dream. In the dream, there was a man whose stature was as tall as heaven, whose stature was as great as the earth. As for his head, he was a god. At his sides, an Anzu bird. At his feet was a whirlwind. To his right and left, lions were lying down. He commanded me to build his house, but I did not understand what he meant. The vision continues with more mysterious symbols, daylight breaking over the land, a woman holding a gold stylus, consulting a star tablet, a warrior with a lapis lazuli tablet, drawing a temple plan. Nanshi interprets. The giant figure is Ningirsu, Lagash's patron god, commanding Gudur to build his temple. The woman is Nisaba, goddess of writing and grain, designing the temple plan. The warrior is Ningirsu again, showing Gudur the architectural specifications. The dreams aren't vague inspirations. They're detailed instructions from gods using supernatural vision to communicate precise building requirements. But Gudur remains uncertain. He receives a second dream. This time Ningirsu appears more explicitly, reiterating the command and promising prosperity if Gudur obeys. The god provides specific details: where to source materials, how to organize labour, which rituals to perform during construction, what offerings to make at completion. Cylinder A devotes hundreds of lines to describing the temple construction, the massive cedar beams imported from Lebanon, the gold and silver decorations, the precious stones inlaid in walls, the artisans commissioned from distant lands. The detail is extraordinary. The text names specific workers, describes technical processes, lists material quantities with accounting precision. This isn't legendary temple building. It's documentation of an actual construction project, framed within the narrative of divine command. The significance for divine kingship lies in how Gudur's authority is established. He doesn't claim to rule through conquest, inheritance, or popular support. His legitimacy derives entirely from divine appointment communicated through dreams. Ningirsu selected him specifically, appeared to him directly, commanded him personally. The temple project proves his divine mandate. Only a ruler properly connected to the gods could receive such detailed supernatural instructions. But why did Ningirsu choose Gudur? Cylinder A provides clues. Early in the text, Gudur is described as nominated by Inanna, granted wisdom by Enki, and true shepherd, called by the heart of Nanshi. Multiple gods had already recognized him before the dream visions occurred. His divine connections pre-existed the temple project. The dreams confirmed and specified a mandate already present through his sacred bloodline. Later in the text, Gudur describes himself as true shepherd called by heart, son of Bau. Bau was the healing goddess of Lagash, consort of Ningirsu. Calling himself son of Bau makes a biological claim. Gudur possessed divine parentage, at least in theological sense. His legitimacy derived not merely from divine favour, but from divine descent. This combination, divine ancestry plus direct supernatural communication, created the strongest possible legitimacy in Sumerian political thought. Gudur could point to both genealogical credentials and personal divine encounter. He carried sacred blood from his ancestors and received direct commands from gods in vision dreams. Both hereditary and charismatic authority combined in one ruler. The temple he built, the the Ninnu, became Lagash's religious centre. But more than that, it became physical proof of Gudea's divine connection. The building stood as tangible evidence that gods communicated with this king, that divine blueprints had been supernaturally transmitted and faithfully executed. Anyone doubting Gudea's legitimacy could visit the Ninnu and see the manifestation of divine will. Archaeological excavations at Jesu, Vaingugna, have uncovered foundations consistent with the Gudea cylinder's descriptions. The texts describe a temple on a raised platform with multiple courtyards, specialized chambers, and specific orientations. Excavations revealed exactly such structures dating to Gudea's period. The texts weren't pure mythology. They documented an actual building project with idealized theological framing. This historical grounding makes Gudea's dream visions more intriguing. Either he fabricated supernatural experiences to justify a building project he planned for mundane reasons, or he genuinely believed gods communicated architectural instructions through dreams, or he experienced something, trance states, altered consciousness, psychological phenomena that he interpreted as divine communication. Sumerian culture took dreams seriously as communication channels between divine and human realms. Dream interpreters held professional status. Temple archives preserved dream omens and interpretation manuals. The boundary between waking reality and dream visions was more permeable in Sumerian thought than in modern Western consciousness. Dreams weren't merely subconscious processing, but potential divine messages requiring expert interpretation. For Gudea, divine communication through dreams served multiple functions. It established his legitimacy as chosen by gods. It provided specific instructions for pleasing those gods. It created a public narrative explaining why resources should be mobilized for massive construction projects, and it reinforced the theological framework wherein kings served as intermediaries between divine and human realms, beings whose consciousness could access divine communications inaccessible to common people. This consciousness access might relate to divine bloodline. If kings carried higher percentages of divine essence than common humans, perhaps that sacred component in their nature made them more permeable to divine communication. Gods could reach through dreams to those whose bloodlines made them partially divine themselves. Common humans couldn't receive such visions because they lacked sufficient divine percentage to serve as proper receivers for supernatural transmissions. This would explain why divine appointments always happened to individuals from royal or priestly families, why gods chose kings to receive architectural plans rather than random commoners, why dream visions required proper bloodline credentials before gods would transmit messages. The communication channel itself depended on biological compatibility, sufficient divine blood to bridge human and divine consciousness. Gudea's cylinders also detail the celebration after the temple's completion. The text describes Ningirsu entering his new dwelling, blessing Gudea, promising prosperity for Lagash. Then comes a crucial passage. The king, the god of his city, in the Ninnu, in his holy throne room, gave audience. Gudea, shepherd of Lagash, went inside. The god rose from his holy throne. He received him with joy. The god rose. The god received him. Not passive divine presence, but active divine personality engaging with the human king. The text presents Ningirsu as an agent, a person, a being who literally rose from his throne to greet Gudea. However we interpret this theologically, the Sumerian text treats it as event, not metaphor. The god manifested physically in the temple and interacted with the king. This physical divine presence explains another function of temples in Sumerian thought. They weren't merely worship centres, but divine dwellings. Gods actually inhabited these structures. When kings entered temples, they entered literal presence of gods, who resided there as tangibly as the king resided in his palace. Temple architecture reflected this understanding. The most sacred inner chambers, forbidden to common people, housed the god's throne, bed, dining facilities. The god lived there. Gudir's special relationship with Ningirsu thus involved regular physical proximity to divine presence. He could enter the god's chambers, consult with the deity directly, receive ongoing guidance face to face. This access required the proper sacred bloodline. Only those with sufficient divine percentage could safely approach full divine presence without being destroyed by the encounter. The cylinders emphasize Gudir's intermediary role, the king who carries the divine plans, in whose hands the bright heavens establish the holy designs, who sets up the purification rituals, who examines the omens, who makes the divine powers perfect. He's not merely human administrator or military commander, he's ritual specialist, omen interpreter, divine powers manager. His functions are priestly and biological. He can carry divine plans and make divine powers perfect because his bloodline grants him the capacity. In the text's conclusion, Gudir lists blessings granted to Lagash: abundant harvests, successful trade, military security, social harmony. All flow from the properly built temple housing the properly served god, maintained by the properly appointed divine-blooded king. The system works as integrated whole. Divine bloodline enables divine communication. Divine communication provides divine instructions. Divine instructions, when executed, produce divine favour. Divine favour manifests as tangible prosperity, whether Gudir genuinely experienced the dreams described, or whether he utilised dream narrative as literary device to frame his temple project. The cylinders reveal Sumerian assumptions about kingship. Legitimate authority required divine connection, both genealogical and experiential. Kings needed to descend from sacred bloodlines and receive direct divine communications. The combination proved divinity flowed through them, justifying their exercise of power over human populations. The Gudir cylinders sit in the Louvre's Mesopotamian galleries. The cuneiform remains readable after more than 4,000 years. The text documents a ruler who claimed gods appeared to him in dreams, commanded him to build, provided architectural specifications, blessed his work, and granted him audience in the completed temple. Whether these events happened as described, happened differently, or were literary constructions framing mundane politics, the texts show us how Sumerian kings established legitimacy through claims of divine descent and divine communication, preserved in meticulous written accounts testify that gods and kings interacted directly, divinely appointed rulers, carrying out divinely designed plans. The Me, portable divinity. In Sumerian theology, the gods possessed certain powers, attributes, and capabilities that enabled them to function as gods. These weren't merely abstract qualities, but tangible things, objects, essences, formulas. The Sumerian term is Me, and understanding what the Me were illuminates the Sumerian concept of transferable divinity. The Me were diverse. Kingship was one Me. Justice was another. Priesthood, warfare, music, craftwork, sexual intercourse, prostitution, truth-telling, lying, law, fear, triumph. Each was a separate Me. Scholars have identified over 100 distinct Me mentioned across Sumerian texts. They functioned like computer programs, like formulas, like tools. Whoever possessed the relevant Me could exercise that capacity. Without the Me, even gods couldn't perform the associated function. This makes the Me radically important for kingship. Legitimate rulers needed the kingship Me. Without it, they couldn't actually function as kings regardless of military power or popular support. But the Me weren't automatically granted. They had to be obtained, transferred, preserved, and they could be stolen. The myth Inanna and Enki narrates exactly such theft. The story begins in Eridu, where Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, possesses all the Me. Inanna, ambitious young goddess of Uruk, travels to Eridu and visits Enki in his Abzu Freshta realm. Enki, pleased by the visit, offers Inanna beer. They drink together. As Enki becomes drunk, he begins giving Inanna the me, one after another, transferring divine powers from himself to her. The text lists the me transferred. He gave her the high priesthood, godship, the noble enduring crown, the throne of kingship, shepherdship, kingship, the numerous priestly offices, truth, descent into the underworld and ascent, the art of lovemaking, the art of prostitution, the art of speaking, the art of music. The list continues for dozens of lines, cataloguing civilizational capacities, religious functions, social institutions, technological skills, emotional states, moral qualities. Drunk Enki gives them all away. Inanna loads the me onto her boat of heaven and departs for Uruk. When Enki sobers and realizes what he's done, he sends demons to retrieve the me. But Inanna's assistant Ninshaba fights them off at each of Uruk's city gates. Inanna reaches the city successfully with all the me intact. Enki accepts the transfer, and Uruk becomes the centre of civilization, possessing the divine powers previously concentrated in Eridu. Modern interpreters often treat this as political allegory, Uruk supplanting Eridu as Sumer's dominant city, with the myth providing theological justification for the power shift. But the text mechanics reveal Sumerian assumptions about how divine attributes worked. They weren't metaphysical abstractions, they were transferable objects. Enki physically gave them to Inanna. She physically loaded them onto a boat. She physically transported them to Uruk. The me could change location, change ownership, be stolen, retrieved, fought over, possessed, lost. This tangibility applied to kingship specifically. The me of kingship was an object, power, formula that had to be transferred to new kings. The Sumerian king list's phrase kingship was lowered from heaven describes this transfer. The me descended physically from divine realm to human world, was granted to specific individuals, passed through dynasties, and could be withdrawn if gods decided a dynasty no longer merited possession. But if the kingship me was transferable and tangible, what exactly was it? The texts offer tantalizing clues without clear answers. In some contexts, me seem to be objects, physical items that could be held, moved, stored. In other contexts, they seem to be knowledge, formulas, techniques, secrets that could be learned and taught. In still others, they seem to be powers, capabilities that manifested in those who possessed them, enabling functions impossible without them, perhaps all three simultaneously. A me might manifest as an object, sepa, regalia, embody knowledge, ritual formulae, administrative techniques, and grant power, authority, wisdom, capability. The object contained the knowledge and conferred the power. Possessing the physical me gave access to the information it encoded and the abilities it enabled. This framework explains Sumerian emphasis on royal regalia, crowns, thrones, sceptres, ceremonial weapons. These weren't merely symbols of authority. They were the me of kingship made tangible. A king who possessed the physical objects possessed the kingship me and thereby could function as legitimate ruler. But without the objects, without the me, no amount of military strength or administrative skill sufficed for true kingship. It also explains why conquering dynasties so often sought to capture the regalia of defeated kings. Seizing the physical objects meant seizing the me they embodied. You couldn't establish new legitimate dynasty merely by defeating old one militarily. You needed to capture the me of kingship, physically take the objects containing those powers and transfer them to your own possession. The me concept connects directly to divine bloodline questions. If certain me could only be wielded by those with sufficient divine percentage, then possessing the objects wouldn't suffice for common humans. They might hold the crown, but without sacred blood to activate it, the me would remain dormant. Like a key without matching lock, like software without compatible hardware, the me required proper biological substrate to function. This might explain why usurpers so frequently married into royal families they overthrew. Military conquest captured the physical objects embodying the me, but successful wielding of those me required divine blood percentage to activate them. Marriage to a royal princess or queen provided that bloodline credential, allowing the conqueror's heirs to legitimately possess and wield the captured me. Some me applied broadly, all humans could participate in basic me like eating, speaking, sleeping. But specialized me required specialized recipients. The me of kingship required royal bloodline. The me of high priesthood required priestly lineage. The me of wise judgment required sufficient divine wisdom component. The biological requirement ensured me were used appropriately by those qualified through heredity to wield divine powers. This makes the Inanna and Enki myth more interesting. Inanna, as goddess, possessed full divinity and could therefore wield any me she acquired. Her theft from Enki represented redistribution of divine powers among gods, but also made those powers available in Uruk for human rulers descended from Inanna's bloodline or connected to her through sacred marriage rituals. Kings who united with Inanna through hierosgamos didn't just receive divine essence, they gained access to the me she held. The sacred marriage transferred not only biological divine component, but functional divine capabilities. The king, through union with Inanna, became able to wield me that otherwise would have remained beyond his capacity. Other texts describe me transfer through different mechanisms. Divine appointment dreams, like Gudea experienced, might include me transfer, the god granting the ruler specific capabilities needed for appointed task. Royal investiture rituals involved symbolic objects that embodied relevant me. Even military conquest, if approved by gods, represented me transfer. The gods withdrew me from failed dynasty and bestowed them on victorious dynasty. But always, successful me use required the biological compatibility of divine bloodline. The me were tools, but divine tools requiring divine operators. Humans with purely human ancestry couldn't activate them. Only those with sacred percentage, inherited from divine ancestors, maintained through sacred marriage, reinforced through ritual contact with gods, could successfully wield the me of kingship. This theological framework structured Sumerian political philosophy. Legitimate kingship wasn't achieved through human means, military strength, popular support, administrative skill, economic power. Those might help someone seize a throne, but couldn't make them legitimate kings. True kingship required three components: divine bloodline, biological capacity to wield divine powers, me of kingship, the divine powers themselves, transferred from gods or previous legitimate rulers, and divine approval, ongoing sanction of the ruler's exercise of those powers. Remove any component and legitimacy collapsed. A ruler without divine bloodline couldn't wield the me even if he possessed them. A ruler without the me couldn't function as king even if he had divine ancestry. A ruler without divine approval would face disaster even if he possessed both bloodline and me. The system created interlocking requirements, ensuring only those properly qualified through heredity, proper transfer, and divine sanction could successfully rule. It prevented, in theory, usurpation by unqualified individuals. It protected divine order by restricting access to sacred powers. It maintained cosmic hierarchy with gods above, divine-blooded kings mediating, and common humans below. Whether the me existed as described, whether divine powers really required sacred bloodlines to activate, whether any of this metaphysical machinery had physical reality, these questions remain unanswerable from outside the Sumerian worldview. What we can document is that Sumerians structured their entire political system around these assumptions. They wrote extensive texts describing me. They recorded their transfer through multiple mechanisms. They established institutions ensuring proper me use by properly qualified bloodlines. The concept of me reveals Sumerian theology as sophisticated system, not primitive superstition. They theorized divinity as modular, composed of distinct powers, transferable between beings, requiring compatible substrates to function. Modern computer programmers might find the concept oddly familiar, divine software requiring divine-blooded hardware to run properly. The texts preserve detailed me lists, transfer narratives, theft accounts, proper use instructions. The cuneiform doesn't explain the ultimate nature of these divine powers, but it documents that Sumerians believed divinity wasn't unitary essence, but collection of specific capabilities, that these capabilities could be possessed and transferred, and that using them required the biological compatibility of divine bloodline. The me remain mysterious. Were they real things or theological constructs? But their function in Sumerian thought is clear. They explained how divine powers operated, how kingship worked, and why some humans could rule while others couldn't. They answered the question of what made kings special beyond raw power, and they provided mechanism for understanding how divinity itself could be transferred, maintained, and concentrated in specific bloodlines. Shulgi's impossible claims. King Shulgi ruled the third dynasty of Ur from approximately 2094 to 2047 BEC, a reign of 48 years that we can verify archaeologically through dated administrative tablets, building inscriptions, and year-name formulae. He was a historical figure. His empire existed. His policies shaped Mesopotamian politics for generations. But the hymns he commissioned about himself make claims that stretch far beyond mundane kingship. The Shulgi hymns, preserved on multiple tablets including CBS 7076 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, present the king describing his own divine nature in first person. These aren't court poets praising their patron. These are royal autobiographies claiming superhuman capabilities. Shulgi hymn B states, I, Shulgi, the noble king, have been blessed by An with a favourable destiny from birth. I am a warrior born from Ninsun's womb. I am a fierce lion with a frenzied heart. I was suckled at the udder of the goddess Ninsun. I was nourished at the holy breast of the goddess. The claim is biological. Shulgi states he was born from divine womb, Ninsun, the same goddess mother of Gilgamesh. He was nursed at divine breasts. The phrasing parallels Gilgamesh's two-thirds divinity formula. Shulgi isn't claiming metaphorical divine favour, but literal divine parentage and nursing. The hymn continues with physical claims. I, Shulgi, ran from Nippur to Ur like a lion. I covered the distance without stopping, like Utu the sun god crossing the sky. I reached Ur before sunset. At Ur I celebrated the festival, performed the sacred rites, made the offerings. The same night I returned to Nippur, covering the journey again without rest. The distance from Nippur to Ur measures approximately 160 kilometers. Shulgi claims to have run this distance twice in one day, 320 kilometers total, while also performing lengthy religious ceremonies at Ur. This requires superhuman endurance. Elite marathon runners today complete 42 kilometers in roughly 2 hours. Shulgi claims 8 times that distance, plus ceremonial activities, all within daylight and nighttime hours of a single day. Impossible? By normal human standards, absolutely. But Shulgi presents it as accomplished fact, witnessed by temple personnel at both cities. Either he's lying spectacularly to an audience that knows he's lying, or he genuinely believed his divine percentage granted capabilities beyond human limits, or the text encodes something other than literal athletic achievement. The third option seems unlikely given the specificity. The hymn doesn't say I travelled swiftly or I journeyed with divine speed. It provides measurable claim, Nippur to Ur and back in one day, with festival participation included. The text invites verification. Anyone could check whether Shulgi actually appeared at both cities on the specified date. This suggests either the event happened as described, requiring us to accept superhuman capability, or Shulgi possessed such absolute authority that he could make obviously false claims without fear of contradiction. But the latter seems politically risky. Kings who make absurd claims undermining their own credibility don't typically maintain power for 48 years. Another interpretation, Shulgi's divine blood percentage actually did grant enhanced capabilities, not 320 kilometers in a day perhaps, but significantly beyond normal human performance. The text might exaggerate somewhat while capturing genuine superhuman endurance that witnesses found remarkable. If divine blood improved physical capabilities proportionally to divine percentage, a king with substantial sacred heritage might accomplish feats that seemed impossible to common humans. The hymn makes additional claims. I know the cuneiform tablets of Sumer and Akkad. I understand mathematics, accounting, administration. I can write in Sumerian and Akkadian with equal fluency. I have mastered the scribal arts, the musical instruments, the sacred songs, the ritual procedures. I am wise in judgment, clever in counsel, skilled in battle, generous in victory. These capabilities, while extraordinary, remain within possible human achievement, except for their combination. Shulgi claims mastery of multiple languages, mathematics, administration, music, ritual, warfare, diplomacy, all at the highest levels simultaneously. Renaissance men like Leonardo da Vinci demonstrated similar breadth, but even da Vinci didn't claim divine parentage as explanation for his capabilities. Shulgi does. Throughout the hymns, he attributes his abilities to divine birth and divine nursing. The sacred blood flowing through his veins grants him capacities unavailable to purely human rulers. He isn't boasting about personal achievement through study and practice. He's documenting inherited capabilities, biological advantages, genetic gifts from divine ancestors. Another Shulgi hymn preserved on tablet N3255 at Penn Museum describes his relationship with Inanna. Inanna has chosen me as her beloved. She has given me the me of kingship. She embraces me with her holy limbs. She refreshes my divine powers. She makes my reign prosperous, my word authoritative, my justice perfect. The language echoes sacred marriage descriptions. Inanna embraces him with holy limbs, physical contact. She refreshes his divine powers, transfers divine essence. The relationship isn't distant divine approval, but intimate ongoing contact, maintaining Shulgi's sacred percentage. This suggests Shulgi participated in hieroskamos rituals annually, uniting with Inanna through her priestess representatives, receiving biological reinforcement of his divine component. Without this regular renewal, his inherited divine blood might dilute to ineffective levels. The ritual maintained functional sacred percentage. Shulgi also claims direct divine communication. Enlil looks upon me with favour. An has decreed my destiny from birth. Enki grants me wisdom. Ninhursag nurtures me as her son. 4 major deities actively supporting one king. Either this is conventional hymnic exaggeration, or Shulgi experienced what he interpreted as genuine divine contact. Dreams, omens, trance states, synchronicities he read as divine communication. The administrative tablets from Shulgi's reign show he reformed Sumerian bureaucracy, standardized weights and measures, reorganized temple economics, improved military efficiency, expanded trade networks. These accomplishments required exceptional administrative capability. Whether that capability derived from divine blood or from being extremely intelligent and well educated, Shulgi achieved documented success. Perhaps the divine bloodline claims served to explain observable reality. Shulgi was remarkably capable, multilingual, mathematically skilled, administratively brilliant, militarily successful, physically vigorous. His contemporaries, lacking modern concepts of genetics or genius, explained his capabilities through divine ancestry. He possessed abilities beyond normal humans. Therefore, he must possess heritage beyond normal humanity. Or perhaps Shulgi cynically fabricated divine claims to justify his power. He knew he was purely human, but found divine ancestry politically useful. The hymns were propaganda, effective because Bronze Age audiences lacked means to verify or falsify claims about divine parentage. But this interpretation struggles with the investment required. Shulgi commissioned dozens of hymns, performed elaborate rituals, built temples, maintained priestly hierarchies, all supporting the divine bloodline framework. The economic and social costs were enormous. If he knew the claims were false, the investment seems disproportionate. Simpler lies would have been more efficient. The third possibility, Shulgi genuinely believed his own divine ancestry. He experienced life from inside a body that learned quickly, thought clearly, performed vigorously. He compared himself to others and found himself consistently superior. The culture provided an explanation, divine blood. He possessed it. Others didn't. His capabilities proved it. The logic, from his perspective, was sound. This psychological interpretation makes the hymns more poignant. Shulgi wasn't cynically manipulating populations with lies. He was testifying to his own nature as he understood it. He really believed Ninsun birthed him, really believed divine milk granted superhuman endurance, really believed gods communicated with him personally because his sacred blood made him permeable to divine contact. Whether true or false, the belief had profound effects. Shulgi ruled for nearly half a century, maintained stability across a large empire, reformed institutions that lasted beyond his death. His confidence in divine mandate translated into effective governance. The divine bloodline framework, even if objectively false, functioned as psychological technology enabling capable rulers to exercise authority decisively. The Shulgi hymns reveal the subjective experience of divine kingship. What did it feel like to believe you carried godblood? To interpret your own capabilities as manifestations of inherited divinity? To understand your consciousness as partially divine, your thoughts influenced by godly intelligence mixed into your human brain at birth? For Shulgi, apparently, it felt natural. The hymns show no doubt, no qualifying language, no hedged claims. I am born of the goddess Ninsun. Not they say or tradition holds, but direct first-person assertion. Shulgi wrote as someone stating obvious biographical fact. His divine parentage was as certain to him as his rulership of Ur. The tablets preserve these claims. The cuneiform doesn't reveal whether Shulgi ran 320 kilometers in a day or merely claimed to. It doesn't explain whether his multilingual scholarship derived from divine blood or from excellent education. It doesn't answer whether gods actually communicated with him or whether he interpreted psychological experiences as divine contact. What the texts do show is how a successful, historically documented Sumerian king understood and presented his own nature. He claimed divine birth, divine nursing, divine capabilities, divine communication, ongoing divine contact through sacred marriage. And he ruled effectively for 48 years, suggesting that whatever the metaphysical reality, the divine bloodline framework functioned successfully as political and psychological infrastructure. After the flood, the shift. The Sumerian king list treats the flood as absolute rupture, then the flood swept over. One line. But its effects on kingship extend through every subsequent entry. Before the flood, 241,200 years across 8 kings. After the flood, decreasing reigns generation by generation, dynasty by dynasty, until reaching normal human lifespans. The pattern is too consistent for accident. First dynasty of Kish post-flood, Ga'ul rules 1200 years. His successor Gulanuddaba Anapad, 960 years. Palakinatim, 900 years. The numbers decrease but remain superhuman. First dynasty of Uruk, Meshkian-Gasha, 324 years. Emerkar, 420 years. Lugalbanda 1,1200 years, then Gilgamesh 126 years, his son Ur-Nungal 30 years. The drop from Gilgamesh's 126 years to his son's 30 years is startling. One generation sees divine percentage collapse from superhuman to nearly normal. What happened? Did Gilgamesh marry inappropriately outside royal bloodlines? Did he fail to participate in sacred marriage rituals? Did gods decide to accelerate dilution in this dynasty? By the second dynasty of Ur, round 2600 reign lengths approach historical plausibility, Mesh-Ane-Pada ruled 80 years. His son Meshki-Agnana ruled 36 years. Still longer than typical human lifespans, but within possible ranges if we allow for genealogical compression or inflated numbers. By the third dynasty of Ur-Tuti-112-2004 where Shulgi ruled, the reigns match documentation. Ur-Nammu 18 years, Shulgi 48 years, Amar-Sin 9 years, Shu-Sin 9 years, Ibi-Sin 24 years. This progressive shortening across 1,000 years of post-flood genealogy suggests the divine component genuinely diluted over time. The sacred blood mixed with more and more human ancestry. Each generation, unless reinforced through sacred marriage or fresh divine contact, carried slightly less divine percentage than the previous. The biological mathematics worked inexorably toward purely human bloodlines. But this creates a crisis for divine kingship ideology. If divine blood inevitably dilutes, eventually no families retain sufficient sacred percentage for legitimate rule. The system contains its own expiration date. Within enough generations, all royal bloodlines become effectively human, divine heritage diluted to undetectable traces. The Sumerians recognized this problem and developed solutions. Sacred marriage rituals refreshed divine percentage annually. Royal marriages within families concentrated existing sacred blood. Divine appointment dreams established new lines when old ones failed. Temple rituals maintained divine contact. The elaborate religious infrastructure served not just spiritual purposes but biological ones, preserving divine bloodlines against inevitable dilution. Yet the trend continued downward. Historical kings with documented normal lifespans couldn't claim the superhuman longevity of their legendary ancestors. The visible evidence of divine blood, extended life, had disappeared. How could Shulgi claim divine nursing by Ninsun when he clearly lived a normal human lifespan? How could kings assert divine ancestry when they aged and died like common humans? The theological solution, divine blood no longer manifested in longevity but in capability. Kings couldn't live 1,200 years anymore, but they still possess wisdom beyond normal humans, military success beyond normal capability, administrative intelligence beyond common genetics. The divine percentage, though diluted, still granted advantages, just different advantages than the concentrated divine blood of antediluvian ancestors. This theological evolution allowed divine kingship ideology to survive the reality of normal human lifespans. The claim shifted from observable longevity to unverifiable capability. You couldn't prove kings didn't possess divine intelligence or divine wisdom. These qualities, being subjective and comparative, could always be asserted regardless of objective evidence. The flood itself, in Mesopotamian tradition, represented divine decision to limit human life. The Atrahasis epic states explicitly that after the flood, gods implemented measures preventing human populations from becoming too numerous or troublesome again. Among these measures, shortened lifespans. Before the flood, the text implies, humans lived much longer, perhaps inheriting extended life from the divine blood mixed into their creation. After the flood, gods reduced human longevity to prevent the problems that had prompted the deluge. If gods shortened human life generally, then divine-blooded kings would also experience shortened reigns. Their divine percentage might remain high, but the human component subjected them to the new lifespan limits. The decreasing reign lengths in the king list reflected not primarily bloodline dilution, but divine policy change affecting all post-Diluvian humanity. This interpretation preserves high divine percentages in post-flood kings while explaining their shorter lives. Gilgamesh's two-thirds divinity didn't translate to 28,800-year reign because post-flood reality imposed different biological constraints. The divine blood granted him capabilities, but not antediluvian longevity, because gods had restructured biological reality after the catastrophe. Archaeological evidence shows that human lifespans in ancient Mesopotamia averaged 30-40 years, much shorter than modern developed nations, but consistent with ancient populations generally. Kings might have lived slightly longer through better nutrition and less dangerous labour, but not dramatically beyond common ranges. The Sumerian king lists claim that historical kings like Shulgi ruled 48 years, while Lugalbanda ruled 1200 years, requires explanation beyond simple exaggeration. The pattern suggests Sumerian scribes were trying to bridge unbridgeable gaps. They possessed traditions about antediluvian kings who ruled impossibly long. They knew contemporary kings ruled normal lifespans. They needed to create continuity between these incompatible data sets. The decreasing reign lengths provided that bridge, a gradual transition from impossible to possible, maintaining genealogical continuity while accommodating observed reality. But why maintain the continuity? Why not simply separate mythological antediluvian kings from historical post-flood dynasties, presenting them as different genres? Because the genealogical connection mattered profoundly. Historical kings' legitimacy depended on unbroken descent from divine-appointed antediluvian rulers. Breaking the genealogical chain meant breaking the legitimacy claims. So scribes preserved continuity despite its impossibilities, creating a documented lineage from gods to living kings. This genealogical bridge served every subsequent dynasty. Any king could trace ancestry back through the decreasing reign lengths, through the flood to the antediluvian dynasties when kingship first descended from heaven. The documented chain, however problematic, provided what no other source could: proof of divine bloodline extending from present rulers to original God-appointed kings. The shift after the flood reveals the Sumerian king list's true function. It wasn't primarily chronological history, though it contained historical elements. It wasn't purely mythology, though it included mythological material. It was genealogical documentation, proving that divine blood, first concentrated in antediluvian hybrids, flowed through successive generations to contemporary rulers. The decreasing reign lengths documented dilution, but maintained continuity. Whether this genealogy reflected biological reality, theological construction, or political necessity, Sumerians preserved it carefully across centuries. They updated it as new dynasties rose. They maintained it through multiple conquests and cultural transitions. They taught it to student scribes as essential knowledge. The bridge from gods to humans, however impossible it spans, remained foundational to Mesopotamian political legitimacy. The question that remains: the clay tablets sit in museum collections worldwide: Oxford, Philadelphia, Paris, Baghdad, Istanbul, private collections, university archives. The cuneiform remains readable after 4 millennia. The claims remain extraordinary. Kings descended from gods, divine blood in human veins, sacred percentages calculated mathematically, bloodlines tracked across impossible timespans, rituals maintaining genetic divinity, gods appearing in dreams with architectural blueprints. We've examined the evidence: the Weld-Blundell prism with its 241,200 years, the creation accounts mixing divine blood with clay, Gilgamesh's two-thirds divine fraction, sacred marriage chambers where kings united with goddesses, Gudеa's dream visions, The me transferred from gods to humans, Shulgi's claims of supernatural capabilities, the progressive dilution documented across post-flood generations. Mainstream scholarship interprets these texts as mythology, political propaganda, theological legitimization, or cultural constructions of kingship. Divine descent claims aren't taken as biological fact, but as symbolic expressions of authority, ritualized connections between religious and political power, or sophisticated metaphors for civilization's relationship with cosmic order. These interpretations have merit. We possess no evidence that humans lived 28,800 years, no mechanism by which divine essence could be transferred through sexual ritual, no way to verify that Gilgamesh was mathematically 2/3 God, no means to prove Shulgi ran 320 kilometers in a day. From modern scientific perspectives, these claims fall outside observable reality. Yet the Sumerians themselves didn't treat them as metaphor. They filed these texts with administrative documents, not mythology collections. They copied them for over 1,000 years without indication they considered them fictitious. They organized political systems around genealogical legitimacy requirements. They invested enormous resources in rituals maintaining divine bloodlines. They made succession decisions based on ancestry claims we now categorize as myth. If we take their perspective seriously, not accepting their claims as true, but accepting their beliefs as genuine, what were they documenting? 3 possibilities deserve consideration. First, literal truth. Gods existed. Divine human hybrids ruled antediluvian cities. Sacred blood genuinely flowed through royal veins. The mechanisms described, divine blood mixed with clay at creation, transferred through sacred marriage, concentrated through careful breeding, actually functioned as Sumerians believed. The texts are accurate documentation of realities we've lost access to, either through time's passage or through fundamental misunderstanding of what consciousness, life, and divinity actually are. This interpretation requires accepting propositions modern science cannot accommodate. It demands openness to supernatural realities operating by rules different from known physics and biology. It asks whether ancient populations might have experienced realities our materialist frameworks exclude by definition. Most scholars reject this possibility, and perhaps rightly, but rejecting it should be conscious choice, not automatic dismissal. Second, encoded memory. The texts preserve genuine historical information, but in corrupted, mythologized form. Perhaps antediluvian kings were real rulers, whose reigns were recorded in units we no longer understand. Dynasties, generations, astronomical cycles, something other than solar years. Perhaps divine descent claims encoded political legitimacy through different cultural frameworks. Perhaps sacred marriage rituals served real political functions, alliance building, succession management, ceremonial transfer of authority, that text later interpreted through biological divine blood frameworks. This interpretation preserves historical kernels while explaining impossible elements as cultural reprocessing. It suggests Sumerians preserved genuine traditions but reinterpreted them through theological lenses, creating texts that contain history embedded in mythology. Separating historical facts from mythological accretions would be extremely difficult, perhaps impossible, but this approach allows texts to be simultaneously fictitious and truth-bearing. Third, ideological construction. The texts serve political purposes, legitimizing ruling dynasties by creating genealogical charters connecting them to divine origins. The antediluvian kings never existed. Divine blood claims were sophisticated fictions. Sacred marriage rituals were pure political theatre. The entire system functioned as effective mythology, not true, but powerful organising civilization around shared narratives that made cooperation, hierarchy and authority seem natural and divinely ordained. This interpretation treats texts as cultural artifacts, revealing how ancient societies constructed authority rather than documenting supernatural realities. It's probably the dominant scholarly view. It allows rigorous textual analysis without requiring belief in supernatural claims. It explains why texts' claims seem impossible, because they are impossible, invented for political purposes. Each interpretation makes sense within its assumptions. None can be definitively proven or disproven using only the textual evidence we possess. Archaeology can confirm that Ur-Nammu ruled and built temples, but cannot confirm whether he possessed divine blood percentage. Linguistic analysis can pass cuneiform precisely, but cannot determine whether scribes believed what they wrote. Comparative mythology can identify parallels across cultures, but cannot establish whether those parallels reflect shared myth-making patterns or shared memories of actual events. What we can say with confidence, Sumerian civilization invested profoundly in divine kingship ideology. They created institutional infrastructure supporting it. They developed sophisticated theological frameworks explaining it. They maintained genealogical records documenting it across centuries. And they organised political legitimacy around bloodline claims that connected contemporary rulers to antediluvian kings, and ultimately to gods themselves. Whether those bloodline claims reflected biological reality, preserved corrupted historical memory, or constituted purely ideological construction, they functioned. Sumerian civilization thrived for over 1,000 years under kings who claimed divine descent. The political system worked. The society produced remarkable achievements: writing, mathematics, law, architecture, literature, astronomy. Divine kingship ideology, whatever its truth value, enabled effective governance. Perhaps that's what matters most. Not whether gods actually existed or divine blood genuinely flowed through royal veins, but whether the framework enabled human flourishing. The Sumerians believed their kings descended from gods. That belief shaped everything: politics, religion, economics, social hierarchy, personal identity. Within that framework, they built civilization. The question that remains isn't were they right, but something more subtle. What were they right about? What aspects of power, authority, leadership, and human nature did they capture through their divine kingship frameworks that we might be missing with our different frameworks? What did they understand that we've forgotten? Kings aren't gods. We don't believe in sacred bloodlines or divine percentages, but leaders do differ in capability. Some individuals possess abilities, intelligence, charisma, judgment, courage that enable them to govern effectively while others fail. The Sumerians explained these differences through divine ancestry. We explain them through genetics, environment, psychology, neuroscience. Both explanations attempt to account for the same observable reality. Some people are remarkably capable. Whether we attribute that capability to divine blood or favourable genetic inheritance, we're grappling with the same mystery of human variation and excellence. The Sumerian texts don't prove divine kingship, but they document a civilization's sophisticated attempt to understand power, legitimacy, and human potential through frameworks available to them. They preserve those frameworks in clay, in cuneiform, in bureaucratic precision that suggests they took the project seriously. The tablets sit in their climate-controlled storage, the cuneiform shadows catch the light, the claims remain, waiting, not demanding belief, not offering proof, simply presenting testimony from a vanished civilization that organized itself around the idea that some humans carried god blood, that divine ancestry mattered profoundly, and that the genealogical bridge from heaven to earth could be documented, maintained, and preserved through ritual record. Keeping and careful breeding. Were they documenting truth, preserving corrupted memory, constructing useful fictions? The question remains open. The evidence doesn't resolve it. Perhaps it never will. But the Sumerian commitment to preserving these records, their meticulous documentation across impossible time spans, their integration of divine bloodline, claims into every aspect of political and religious life. All of this suggests they believed profoundly in what they were documenting. And perhaps that's the invitation these texts extend, not to accept their claims uncritically, but to take their projects seriously, to consider what it meant to live in a civilization where kings descended from gods, to imagine experiencing reality from inside a framework where divine blood flowed through human veins, where sacred percentages could be calculated, where rituals maintained genetic connections to heaven itself. The cuneiform doesn't demand an answer. It offers an encounter with minds organised differently than ours, yet grappling with questions that remain ours too. What makes legitimate authority? Why do some rule while others follow? What is power? What is divinity? What is human? The Sumerians answered those questions through sacred bloodlines and divine ancestry. Their answers, preserved in clay, wait in museum storage, not insisting on belief, but refusing to disappear. Present, patient, and profoundly strange. Testimony from humanity's first literate civilization that they believed kingship descended from heaven, and they documented that descent with meticulous care across 4,000 years. The question remains, the clay preserves it, and perhaps the uncertainty is the point. Not knowing forces us to think, to consider possibilities, to remain open to realities we might otherwise exclude. The Sumerian texts don't provide answers. They provide evidence of a civilization that had different answers, and those answers worked for them, enabling achievements that still astonish. Whatever the truth, the mystery remains worth contemplating. As you drift towards sleep, let the question linger. Divine blood in human veins, gods walking among mortals, sacred percentages calculated and preserved, kingship descending from heaven. True? False? Something stranger than either? The cuneiform doesn't say, but it remembers. And in that ancient memory, inscribed in clay and preserved through millennia, something persists. A claim, a testimony, a mystery that refuses simple resolution. The Sumerians believed, and their belief, documented with such precision, preserved with such care, asks us to consider what they might have known that we've forgotten. The tablets wait, the question remains. And in the space between ancient claims and modern skepticism, perhaps something worth discovering still lingers.